Very good. Nice to talk to you. I'm Mark Schmitt. I guess since the last time that I did one of these, I have a new job title, as I guess you have one also, or temporarily have one. I'm now a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, which is based in New York, but I'm based in D.C. Roosevelt Institute is a progressive think tank.
Mark, you're breaking up a little bit there, I just want to say.
Sorry. Okay, I'll try to.
Okay, you're back on.
Oh, I know exactly what happened, sorry.
Okay, good. So you say, a new job title, which is senior fellow?
I'm a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, which is a progressive think tank, but it's also a nonprofit connected with the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park. So it's really a fun little opportunity, really kind of.
So where are you physically sitting at the moment?
I'm physically sitting right now. I'm actually physically sitting in my dining room, but most days I physically sit in an office on Massachusetts Avenue in D.C.
I see.
Most of the people there are part of the Roosevelt Campus Network, which is a terrific campus organization of students working on policy issues. They just put out they're about to put out a great kind of federal budget proposal written by entirely by young people.
This is really interesting. I didn't know so much about Roosevelt.
Yeah. Well, we got to hook you into something over there,
well,
especially this year.
I'm Glenn Loury. Let me introduce myself. I'm a visiting professor of economics at Columbia University. Usually I teach at Brown, so that's me.
Good. All right. Well, we've done blogging heads before, and always interesting. I guess I confess that all I'm really paying attention to right now is the budget, the impending shutdown, and Congressman Paul Ryan's proposal to end the New Deal and the Great Society, and them both, depending on how you want.
Well, that's certainly one way of putting it.
Put this country 50 years backwards. Certainly, thinking about the, from the perspective of the Roosevelt Institute, it's a great challenge. But again, it's an interesting. I want to get your views on it and talk about both the substance and politics of it, as well as some other things. But it's definitely. I have to say, it took me by surprise a little bit, because I've always felt like the Republicans like a lot of people like to talk about a lot of cutting of spending, but they kind of know that it's not really all that popular, and they never really put their cards on the table. So all of a sudden to wake up and see, oh my gosh, all the cards are on the table. I wouldn't call it courageous. I think that's a word that's been attributed to Ryan, I think, incorrectly. Because
why is that? Can I just stop you there? Why is it not courageous to stick your head out where it can get chopped off?
Well, his head's not going to get chopped off. He's going to get all the kudos from, he's got a safe Republican seat. He's going to get all the kudos from the, Washington Post editorial board and so forth. Obviously, asking his members to do it would be a little courageous. But again, I don't know how much courage is there in a bad idea. So a little of it depends on that. But it definitely took me by. I have to say, it took me by surprise. I thought they would dodge a little bit, and it's also kind of politically, it is daring, and maybe a little bit reckless from the Republican point of view to drop it in the middle of the week when we're talking about the shutdown. Because now, before it was kind of annoying to me. It was like we were talking about the shutdown, but we weren't really talking about any substantive thing. It was really abstract. And now, all of a sudden, one day later, it's actually about something. It's not literally about that thing, because the CR is different from the 2012 budget, but it's completely changed the conversation.
Okay, so the shutdown is impending. You think it's going to happen? Today is Wednesday. We've got until Friday.
It could be a brief. At this point, people have. At certain points, people have to show that they're willing to go to the brink. And you could do it on Friday, let the government shut down over the weekend, work something short term out on Monday. It doesn't have to be the most brutal shutdown the way it was in 1995, which I was working on the Hill at that time, so I remember that one well.
But let's get down to the particulars. So. There's a number, what is it, 31 billion or something like that? That is, if rather than me say what I don't know, let me just ask the guy who knows. What are the numbers, and what are they arguing about?
Well, what are they arguing about on the shutdown
on the shutdown.
I guess it's between, and some of it some of it is behind the scenes of what the actual proposals are that are on the table. and I know that people are. I mean, I'm a minimal expert because I'm not up there and I'm not asking members what the numbers are. It seems to me that there was a willingness to go to $33 billion in cuts from the point of view of the administration, and then there's also the question of what, if any, riders they allow to go onto those appropriations bills, like riders that say, the Tea Party will insist that there be a rider that says no funding may be used for implementation of the Affordable Care Act. There's a lot of abortion-related riders. Again, an acute reminder of a really, really important point, which is that the culture wars are not over, and social policy is a very big part of what the Republican majority wants to do. It's not simply that they're all about small government, as many people would have you believe.
Yeah.
So that's so it looks. I mean, the Republicans the demand kind of went up to something like $60 billion on the Tea Party side. In a sense, the White House has already given away quite a bit on the side of cuts. But I think Ryan changes everything. I think Ryan gives an opportunity for the White House, if they take it, to say, you've just shown the direction you're taking this country, and your shutdown is part of a step towards that direction, and we're not going there, and I think it creates a tough position for Republicans if they want to kind of keep their distance from the Ryan plan, which they did an interesting thing. I'm actually trying to figure out. I'm not sure how this will work exactly, but when the House wrote their rules for the year, every year the House creates new rules, they did something kind of amazing, which was to put in a rule that said, if we don't actually manage to pass a budget resolution as a body, then whatever Paul Ryan, as chair of the Budget Committee, produces has the effect of not the effect of law, but it has the effect as if we passed a budget resolution, and everything has to conform to that, which is to say the committees have to report legislation in accordance with those budget guidelines, which means
hold on, let me just make sure I understand. Which they can certainly do in terms of ordering the agenda of business for the House of Representatives, but which couldn't possibly have the force of law if not also enacted by the Senate and signed by the President.
Right. But the budget resolution isn't signed by the President. You're supposed to have Congress produces a budget resolution. They don't always do it every year, but they're supposed to do it every year, and that will contain in it instructions to the Appropriations Committee that says, you can spend this much on education, you can spend this much on agriculture, whatever, and they can order cuts, and the Appropriations Committees have to follow that. But it can also contain, for example, it could say to the Ways and Means and Finance Committees, which are, have the power over taxes and most healthcare spending and so forth. It can also say, we need $60 billion in cuts from Medicare. Come up with that however you want, but that's what you're instructed to do. And it actually has the power, by creating a budget reconciliation bill, it has the power to make those committees actually do that thing, match that number, and then report back. All of it, of course, has to be reconciled with the Senate, and it's very complicated to do those things when there's division among the two houses of Congress. Usually the only way that possibly happens is when you have like a giant budget summit with all the leaders in the White House, like we used to have in the 80s and 90s, but which Republicans have made very clear they don't want to do that again. But if Ryan's able to kind of force the House committees to kind of go along with the plan, that's a pretty dramatic, without them actually voting on the underlying resolution, that's a pretty dramatic, somewhat anti-democratic thing, and it makes it harder for individual Republican members to say, actually, they don't have to renounce the Ryan plan, but even if they want to say, I'm not going all the way with what he wants to do on Medicare, it makes it really hard for them to adjust that, since they will have to follow it.
Oh, I see. So the debate that I'm observing is all about about the shutdown. It's all about who's going to get blamed for the shutdown. And there's the specter of 1995 and the Republicans having taken the consensus is a political hit for the events. And then there seems to be a difference of opinion now about whether it would be to the disadvantage of the Republicans or to the detriment of the Democrats were this impasse not to be overcome. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's been the story of the shutdown. Most people, the original feeling about it was because it worked out so badly for the Republicans in '95, which it really did, partly because of Clinton's genius in exploiting it. That's what automatically would happen. The problem is, as with any iterated game, anything game theory, if you've already played that, so everybody now knows how to avoid that. And the Republicans, I think, have been very, very careful about, up to yesterday, really, have been very, very careful about not making it a fight about Medicare or making it a fight about Medicaid. So it's not really clear what it was ever a fight about. It was just a fight about cuts, which I think is very, very much to the Republicans' advantage if it's just a fight about cuts. The Republicans of the Gingrich era of 1995 were much more unabashed about, saying Medicare will wither on the vine, and really the specific demands they made were all about cuts to fairly popular programs. So they put themselves in a very bad position. Up until yesterday, I think the Republicans had not done that, and they were really careful about trying to time the. They weren't going to. They were already backed off a shutdown twice, so they weren't going to be reckless about doing it. And then I think they really had an advantage because the Obama administration really hadn't pressed its advantage in the way that the Clinton administration. I mean, the Obama administration didn't seem willing to turn this into a real battle over popular programs in the way that the Clinton administration had done. And I mean, one line, and I'm gonna just say there's one line on the left, and for example, E.J. Dionne's columns in the Post have been the best example of this. So E.J. says, you can't go into this fight with, I've got my modest cuts here and they've got their big bad cuts over here. You have to go into a fight that's about, are we about spending and investing and getting out of this recession and making this country better versus cutting. You have to make it that black and white cut. I don't agree with that. I think it was very, very important in the long term. Obviously, we need to get our fiscal situation under control, and I think it's very important for the administration to have credibility on being willing to do that. So the administration came out with a budget that had, it even had cuts to education programs. There are, in fact, a lot of wasteful education programs. We're willing to do that. It was a really balanced approach to the budget, which then contrasts to a more extreme approach. But for a while, I think the E.J. Dionne criticism was kind of seemed right, and maybe it still is right, that there wasn't enough of a contrast there to really create a fight that the White House could win. And without that, I do think the shutdown would seem like, everybody at the very best case for the White House would be everybody was equally stubborn, and then they shut down the government. Would be the way it was perceived.
And the president is the only adult in the room.
Well, if the president personally may be the only adult in the room, but he's still not. He's still being stubborn, and Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi, the congressional Democrats are being stubborn too. I mean, it's a very, at the very least, you get a kind of pops and butts your houses. Whereas in 1995, it was very, very clear that Newt Gingrich shut down the government. There wasn't really any doubt about that, and Bob Dole kind of went along reluctantly because he wanted to be the presidential nominee. This was, I think, looking a little different. I think Ryan probably changes that a bit.
Yeah, well, maybe we should talk about. Let me reveal a prejudice that I have. I must say, as a non-political, non-Washington-based person, just reading the newspaper and watching it, which is that it seems to me that so much of the public discussion, I'm not now talking about the Ryan budget, I'm talking about continuing resolutions and government shutdown, is about political maneuvering, positioning, poll reading, and perception. And not so much about, except the screaming that goes on, about a kind of considered debate over, sort of principles, policy, and the role of government. And I find it really annoying. And so one of the things that I find refreshing in Congressman Ryan's plan, which I've read some summary reports of, is there's a very clear, I suppose it's one that you might have to reject at the Roosevelt Institute that you talked
Well,
about.
I'm entitled to my own opinion.
But there's a very clear vision about the role of government. And,
Right.
and it seems to me, a big intellectual problem for the people of the United States of America, not just for the Democrats or the Republicans, as to what the shape of our social contract and the sort of framework of institutions of mutual support and welfare are going to look like going forward, given the demographic and the fiscal pressures.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the president appointed a budget commission, which came with some fairly strong and far-reaching recommendations, some of which, it appears to me, are reflected in at least part of what Congressman Ryan is proposing. But I haven't heard from the president, or for that matter, from the leaders of the Democratic leaders in the Congress, any sort of comparably broad, comprehensive, and sort of over the long term realistic grappling with our condition, and then the articulation based on their values of what the policy framework would look like, given the serious commitment to grappling with our condition. I mean, just too much rhetoric about tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires, and too much rhetoric about shipping jobs overseas, and Social Security is not in trouble. I defy you to prove that it's actuarially sound until et cetera, and not enough talk about what everybody knows is going to have to be done. Or do I betray my old Republican bias from years ago when I was against it?
Yeah, I feel like this is good. I feel like I'm talking to the old Glenn Loury.
Never died.
Good. No, they never do. They never. Well, everything one's ever been should be a part of you. Well, I think that's. It's not wrong, I think, to say that the really comprehensive, alternative vision isn't coming from either the congressional Democrats or the White House. They're definitely holding a little bit back. Although I did think the Obama budget went a long way in setting some of those things out. And to me, the biggest part of the biggest part of the budget story the biggest part of the spending story remains healthcare spending controls, and there were a lot of efforts to do something about that in the Affordable Care Act, many of which got knocked back by the politics. I think it's important to say that the comprehensive projects to come up with an alternative budget, which are the Simpson-Bowles Commission, which I think actually was a very sloppy job. And there were a lot of areas where they said things like, well, let's just agree to put a cap on healthcare spending, and and everybody can agree to that. But obviously, how you're going to make that happen is that's what you wanted agreement on, not just that we all agree that we should spend less on healthcare. What are you willing to do about it? The better one, I think, was the group put together by the Bipartisan Policy Center with Alice Rivlin, former director of the OMB, and former Senator Pete Domenici running it. I thought that was the much more thorough one, and that had something like the Medicare voucher proposal that's in the Paul Ryan bill.
Which is driving everybody crazy.
Which is driving everybody crazy. Which is driving everybody crazy. It had something like it, different in significant ways. I actually haven't looked at a side-by-side between those two, but that's one where you could say, yeah, this was in this bipartisan agreement. And that was a commission that was made up, less of elected officials like Simpson-Bowles was, and sort of, they're corporate people who I'm really, really certain that those, CEOs on those commissions fly in, pay. If they fly in for, the 2 hours of the meeting, look briefly at the materials and fly back out. So the other commission, I thought the Rivlin Domenici Commission, was much more deeply engaged in the issues and had the people who really know what they're doing on these issues. That was in there. But both of those commissions were really, really aggressive about setting out from the start a balance between tax increases and spending cuts, and setting some percentage. I can't remember what the percentage was in Simpson-Bowles. It may have been 2-to-1. It's still a lot of emphasis on spending cuts, but none of that was there in the Ryan plan. So the Ryan plan really takes the form of massive spending cuts coupled with very significant tax cuts, which actually, according to CBO, probably put us in a worse fiscal position than we were. So I think to sort of treat the Ryan plan as if it were a variation on these bipartisan plans, I think is kind of a mistake.
Oh, okay. Well, the line is we're not in a hole because we're taxing too little. We're in a hole because we're spending too much. What's wrong with that line?
Well, I mean, we're doing a lot of spending through the tax system, obviously. The whole is the difference between your taxing and your spending. So it's sort of an ideological viewpoint about which you think is more important. I'd rather I'd like those lines to meet at some point,
yeah.
And I don't think there's no obvious reason why it's better for those lines to meet as a result of spending cuts, just talking in the abstract, as opposed to fairly moderate tax increases that bring us back to, let's say, the Clinton era levels. 39% on the very incomes above $250,000 is pretty as in the course of American history is pretty moderate, especially if you continue to have lower rates on capital gains and things like that.
But why not raise the capital gains?
I would prefer to raise the capital gains rate. I'm a classic tax reformer. My principle would always be broadest base possible,
yeah,
with less income excluded in order to have the lowest rate possible, and then you have far less non-productive economic activity that's going into avoiding taxes, all kinds of issues that people yell and scream about, like the hedge fund carried interest loophole. All those things disappear because they only exist for people to shift income from the labor category to the capital gains category. And of course, when Warren Buffett says it's wrong that my secretary pays more taxes than pays taxes, at a higher average rate than I do, of course he's absolutely right.
Yeah.
So I could go either way on that, but there are a lot of ways to increase revenues. But I think you've got to increase revenues. And the only way to decrease spending, the Ryan plan, yeah, if you really want to decrease spending and also cut taxes, you have to do some things on the scale of the Ryan plan, which are going to have the effect of enormously shifting risks onto individuals in the case of Medicare and onto states in the case of Medicaid. And I think the genius of well-designed programs is that they socialize or share risks that really ought to be shared. They create social insurance systems that balance those risks out, and we've clearly put more and more risks, as for example with the shift from defined benefit pensions to 401ks and other defined contribution.
Well,
we're all bearing more and more risk, and banks and things are bearing less and less risk.
Yeah, but so let's take this voucherization of Medicare. Okay, so as I understand it, rather than an open-ended commitment that services would be paid for under Medicare by the federal government for seniors who require them under some conditions, but without any limit, there would be a provision of in effect a voucher that would underwrite the cost of insurance that would be purchased in the private market by seniors who could add their own resources to the value of the voucher and purchase whatever policy the market would be able to provide at that price, which presumably would cover some things, would not cover some things, would have less open-ended character than the current regime. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not sure what's wrong with that. I'm not sure why that's somehow turning our back on seniors or giving up on the welfare state. I mean, in the pension area, I'm one of many people who has a defined contribution. My employer contributes, I contribute. At the end of the day, it's worth what it's worth. Nobody's guaranteeing me 80% of my best 3 years of salary, as I might have gotten if I had been a public employee in some positions. Right. And no one really.
And you know that, and you can handle that, and I'm in the same position, and that's totally fine for us. And we know we're bearing a risk that, you know, I mean, my parents actually never had pensions, but we're bearing a risk that previous manufacturing unionized generation didn't bear.
Would not have had to bear. That's right. We know we're bearing it. It's not killing us. I mean, it is what it is.
It may. I mean, you know, if you happen to come out, I mean, obviously a lot of people took a big hit right at the time of their retirement or whatever, had to readjust their plans. But yeah, we're bearing it's not the end of the world to bear risk. I mean, I don't think. But it is. You have to see this, I think, in the context of an overall kind of risk shift to individuals and families, the kind of thing that Jacob Hacker has written about a lot. This would sort of be the tidal wave of the granddaddy of all shifts. I think the specific voucherization of Medicare, I mean, to me, nobody's ever quite answered the question of how are you going to create a private insurance market for people 65 or older, which is a population that almost every single one of them is going to incur some major medical costs between turning 65 and the end of their lives. The reason we can have a private healthcare system at all is because it stops at 65 when Medicare takes over. So if you're an insurance company, you can be pretty confident some people are going to have big healthcare costs before they're 65, and some people aren't. So you can create a reasonable insurance system. That's just not, a healthcare system for health insurance for people over 65 is like, car insurance solely for boys 16 to 18.
Got it.
It's not.
Premiums will be pretty high.
It's really hard to imagine that premiums wouldn't be, and the amount of regulation. At that point, the amount of regulation you would have to do to make sure, especially, an 80-year-old with diabetes could be covered in any way, the amount of regulation you would have to do becomes so staggering that what's the point? Then you're starting to complain about, the big government. You have to have such a tightly regulated system that it's essentially a public utility system anyway. You'd be paying a fairly strict cost, which is sort of similar to. It was funny in the fight over Social Security privatization in 2005. There was a point where the Bush administration said, "Well, to prevent people from having disastrous outcomes and losing all their money in the stock market, we'll actually require annuitization. In other words, require people to buy an annuity so that they get a fixed amount of money with their private savings account." It's like, well, at that point, you've just kind of gone through this whole ritual just to recreate something that does what Social Security does, and all you've done is run it through Wall Street instead of running through the Treasury without really changing anything very dramatic. And I think you'd probably wind up with something similar here. And what you'd have to pay insurance companies in order to get them to make this market might be enormous.
Well, isn't part of the story here that when you put risk on people, you also change their incentives so that they internalize what these costs? I mean, so let me be concrete.
Yeah.
I read a piece in the Times recently about dialysis, and the issue was people are suffering kidney failure, and they also have many other conditions that are impairing their longevity, and whether or not to go into dialysis or go into something else. Mm-hmm. Something else being, basically dying from kidney failure over some period of time. So there's a kind of hospice-like margin that people were playing around with. And the point of the story is that it's fine to talk about this in theory, but whenever the patient is actually confronted with the alternative between 6 more months of life on dialysis or foregoing dialysis and thereby guaranteeing the likelihood that they would not survive, even though their odds of survival beyond the short period of time that they're going to be on dialysis is not that great, they'll nevertheless choose it because people are going to choose that whenever they can.
Right.
But the incentives are all messed up by the fact that people are guaranteed, to the extent that they make the choice to get the dialysis, to have the cost of it underwritten by the public sector's commitments to them. They don't have the incentives to make the quote unquote right decision. If they were spending their patrimony, for example, in order to extend their lives, they might make a different decision in that horrible circumstance that none of us wants to be in, but that all of us are going to end up in one day.
Right. Well, yeah, and I think that example, makes it really stark and tough. And even if you didn't have Medicare to pay for that, let's say you're under 65 and in a similar situation, a lot of people would spend down everything they have and borrow from their children or whoever they can borrow from, in order to do that, because it's a life or death situation. I think that there are other examples of that, which all the Dartmouth studies about health care go to. There are definitely ways in which, the bigger question would be, what about 20 years earlier, when that person could have done a certain number of things with diet and medication that prevents them from ever getting into that dilemma, but they have, neither they have an incentive, nor really does their insurance company have an incentive to do that kind of preventive stuff, especially if the insurance company knows that by the time kidney failure really becomes a costly problem, that person is going to be on Medicare and not the insurance company's problem. So there's no incentive there for the insurance company either. So I think there are definitely situations where the skin in the game issue really does matter. A lot of the over-testing that's over-testing and over-treatment, the level of testing for prostate cancer, that if people actually make that choice, I'm told by people who've done some of this research, people are better informed about those costs and the limited benefit of a lot of the things that we do as precautionary medicine. They could make more responsible choices about it. It's not a huge portion of the excessive healthcare cost that we have. Getting healthcare inflation under control requires a lot of steps, some of which were in the Affordable Care Act. It's a lot of comparative effectiveness research. It's a lot of stuff that got demagogued as death panels, and but all of it has to be done. And the voucher, which simply says you'll do it if you have skin in the game, applies in some situations. I don't think it applies in a lot of the situations that really wind up being costly, especially that last year of life kind of cost, where people aren't necessarily able to make rational choices for themselves. It's really it's a huge problem, and I think that the voucher is a pretty oversimplified way of fixing it. That's my view.
So how's the president doing? It looks, again, I'm not a political person. I'm up here in New York City,
right?
And reading the newspaper. But he says he'll keep calling them back to the White House every day if necessary. He seems to be pretty deft, in my view, in the handling of the politics of this, even though he may not get a Profile and Courage award on this one.
Right. I mean, he's deft and I say this, I'm somebody who's been endlessly forgiving of President Obama when a lot of liberals have just been screaming at me, and I'm sort of people think I'm buying access to the White House or something like that, when I actually have very little. I haven't even been there. I know a few people here and there, but I'm not at all on message. I just happen to be have generally been pretty sympathetic to the president where he's going. I generally, a week or two ago, I came around to the view that they weren't doing great on the messaging around the budget. They weren't actually letting it be. They were more interested in being seen as the adult in the room for reelection purposes. Very similar to that, the triangulation of the Clinton period. Than they were in actually making sure that we come out in a stronger position to be able to, do the kinds of things that we need to do in this country, do stimulus spending when we need to do it, make the case for, really fix Medicare rather than fall into one of these schemes. I didn't think they were handling it. Starting about 2 weeks ago, I felt like they weren't handling this well at all. Now I'm beginning to see, maybe, I guess when they came out with the budget with all those cuts, I felt like this is great, now you're being responsible, and then at the moment when the Republicans are crazy irresponsible, in my view, and maybe not in yours, that's when you turn it, and that's when the payoff to being responsible comes. And I didn't feel they'd made the turn, but now it's an opportunity. I feel like they've gotten a little bit of a second chance here. But I mean, this is the week that maybe we call this a second topic here. This is the week when Obama launched his reelection campaign with Jim Messina as campaign manager.
Yes.
It's clearly a very different kind of election campaign. It is, we're going to raise $1 billion from very rich people kind of election campaign, as opposed to 2008. Some of that's just you're never going to get you're never going to recapture what happened in 2008. No matter what, being president of the United States just creates a whole bunch of different pressures and incentives that make that very, very hard to do. But again, it's a little bit demoralizing, I think, to
where did you come down on this $1 billion? I mean, people are bragging about this, and I'm horrified at this. I mean, I saw your old boss, Bill Bradley, on television this morning. As it happens, it was
good. I'm glad he's getting out there.
He was on one of the cable channels, asked about campaign finance and all that kind of stuff, and he went on. I thought he was very persuasive.
I remember, when I worked for him was, in the late '90s when he started doing stuff on campaign finance reform, and I helped write the speech that he gave, and had this whole thing about how I guess 1996 was going to be the first $1 billion election, which means everybody put together for federal office spent $1 billion.
Got it.
And wasn't that outrageous? And that's only 15 years ago, and now it's one candidate spending $1 billion.
Yeah, well, our president hasn't done much to, other than castigate the Supreme Court for its mistaken decision in that campaign finance case. Mm-hmm. I mean, he didn't take the public money during the 2008 campaign because it gave him the advantage not to do it. Right. And now his people are bragging about they're going to raise $1 billion. And where's that going to come from? I mean, we know where it's going to come from. Right. It's going to come from those millionaires and billionaires who the Democratic Party demagogues are so fond of invoking. About the rich. It's going to come from the rich, from people who have an interest in access and influencing the agenda of the government. So, okay.
And it's not going to come in. And it's not going to come in $200 contributions, and it's not going to come in $2,400 regulated contributions either. It's going to come through other vehicles that are being set up that will, be able to take $50,000, $100,000 more from an individual. That's the way. That's it. That's what it is. And I wouldn't say do it with your hands tied behind your back. I mean, somebody like Russ Feingold tried to run according to his principles. He's not in the Senate anymore.
I understand.
That's not an exact parallel because the election where he limited himself was the one he squeaked out before. I don't think he limited himself as much this time, but it's tough to do.
Okay, so a third war in an Arab country. Trying Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in Guantanamo. So $1 billion presidential campaign. When I hear Bernie Sanders talking about this, he's mad. How come you're not?
Because I'm a total sucker for the Obama administration. I always have been. There's a lot. Everything has a counterfactual. What's the thing you could have done that would allow you to do this differently? I don't know that. Once all other avenues for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed were blocked.
Yeah.
By Schumer and Cuomo, and once that opportunity is out there, you don't have another choice there, and they sat on their hands for a while and ultimately decided this is what we have to do. I don't like it, I hate it, but I don't think it was purely an autonomous decision by the White House. And that's just a reality. Was there something they could do? I mean, maybe if they just, there are a lot of things where the White House's failure to move quickly on a lot of things made a big difference. So, when you had the big political advantage, get some things done, like get the civilian trials going and get them and get them into operation. Act more quickly on those civil liberties issues. Get appointments made. You have a lot of things that are being blocked now like, for example, Peter Diamond at the Federal Board of Governors.
Peter, an old teacher of mine, as it happens.
Yeah, a Nobel Prize winning economist, and
he's worthy.
Richard Shelby has the nerve to say.
Apolitical. Well, anyway.
He's a what?
He's apolitical. I mean,
yeah.
He's not some raving radical. He's a very not politically conservative, but a very sort of temperamentally conservative man who sticks to his knitting. Right.
Extremely sophisticated technical economist.
Indeed.
And the idea that Richard Shelby, the idea that Richard Shelby can pronounce him not qualified to serve is really extraordinary. Those things actually wouldn't be problems if the administration had acted more quickly at the beginning to get those positions filled, to get judgeships filled. I think there's a lot of missed opportunities by that early inaction. On Libya, I sort of don't really have an independent. I can see the humanitarian aspect of it. I can see also the enormous risk of a third war. It's very interesting to see how people have lined up, and a lot of it brings us a lot of it almost leapfrogs you back, so that the alignments are more like the alignments around Kosovo than they are like the alignments around Iraq or Afghanistan. But then people are, for a lot of people who are much more involved in foreign policy and national security issues than I am, the Balkans experience was a really important lesson in when American force can be used well, when it can't, what is the potential for liberal interventionism, and they felt like they got some positive, they got a lesson out of that, and that lesson leads you to have to be willing to do something about the potential massacre in Benghazi. But obviously it still leads you to a lot of places where you aren't going to do anything, like Cote d'Ivoire.
Yeah.
But that's probably the limit of my opinion about it.
Okay.
Why aren't you angry?
Why am I not angry?
Yeah. Why are you angry? Are you?
Well, on the Guantanamo situation, clearly there are the political constraints. They said they were going to try them in New York City, and all hell broke loose. The Congress wouldn't permit it, and not just the Republicans, as you mentioned, but especially Democrats. And maybe it was a little ill-conceived to have used this rhetoric during this anti-Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld. Those guys are, dragging America's reputation through the mud. They're a bunch of, the president didn't say this, but some of his supporters did, war criminals who are, shredded the U.S. Constitution and so forth. And then find after you get into office that, it was really a pretty tough problem about what to do with these people, and et cetera. So maybe you can kind of understand that. I don't know. I don't think Eric Holder is looking very good, I must say. I don't know him personally. I don't have anything against him, and I'm not going to join this bandwagon of vilification of Holder that the Fox News people are engaged in. Right. But at the end of the day, he doesn't come off looking like he has a whole lot of influence with the president. Right. If he actually believes what he's been saying, and I don't know. On Libya, humanitarian intervention and all of that, I think we've looked. I think the administration's looked a little bit incoherent. I don't understand the policy, and here I will echo some of the stuff that I've heard on the right. If Gaddafi has to go, the president of the United States doesn't say he has to go, and then not be willing to endorse the means that would be necessary to make those words a reality. So a declaration that he has to go, coupled with a protocol of military engagement that explicitly stipulates that his removal is not an objective and has implications for the restraint on what activities can at least overtly be engaged in toward that end, seemed not entirely coherent to me. Disappointed? Well, I've been disappointed for a long time with the putatively progressive, but I think really not at all how do I want to put this? Putatively progressive, but at the end of the day, shrewdly pragmatic administration that's played itself out over the last 2.5 years. Right. So I've been disappointed for a long time. So, for example, on the racial equality front, I regret the fact that the president, for political reasons, can't really say very much at all about racial issues. I don't doubt that, quote, his heart is in the right place, close quote, but I think the irony is that his being black probably makes him less able to directly and explicitly engage such issues with the presidential bully pulpit than would be the case if he were an equally liberal white Democrat.
Right.
And, you know, so all of this hype about the first African-American president, coupled with his relative impotency in being able to direct the government toward the goal of racial equality for political reasons, is frustrating to me.
Right. That was sort of, in a way, it was the one point where he kind of came out of that shell was actually one of the first great mishandled moments, I thought, was the beer summit with Skip Gates.
Yes.
Just didn't make any, he put himself out there in a way that you probably shouldn't put yourself out there, talking about
I agree.
a weird local situation that that you don't really know that much about, and then the moment where he's out there talking about race was sort of trying to solve that instead of really talking about the bigger issues which affect people who are not Skip Gates.
I wrote exactly this in the New York Times.
Okay, well then I probably absorbed that.
No, it's okay. That was precisely what I was saying.
Yeah.
I mean, Gates, whatever, okay? But that's not an important thing, right? In that the president should end up having the comment be made in that context, and then have, police unions and a half dozen Massachusetts towns calling press conferences to denounce him.
Right.
And then he has to retreat and has to put this happy face on the thing with a beer summit, but
Right.
the possibility of substantively engaging this issue of, domestic security, crime, policing, race, shootings in cities, over-incarceration of African-American males, profiling, about which presidential leadership might have something very valuable to offer. That
Have they done anything?
Evaporates. He has to run away from it.
He was very clear on the crack powder sentencing disparity. Have they done anything about that? I can't remember.
Yeah, I can't name the statute, but the effective disparity, which was that a mandatory minimum federal sentence would be triggered by a certain amount of weight of crack and 100 times more weight of powder cocaine to trigger. Mm-hmm. That disparity has been reduced to approximately 18 to 1 in the current regime. There was a piece of legislation enacted and signed into law that changed the federal sentencing such that the disparity was still there, but it was at less of a extent.
Right. So some progress on one of the few things that he was really willing to talk about.
Yeah.
I thought. Yeah.
Okay, well, Mark, I think I need to terminate our conversation at this point.
I think we all have our obligations.
Indeed, we do.
It's always fun to talk to you, Glenn, and we'll do it again.
Thanks for the education on the budget.
Well, thanks for your points as well. Okay.
Okay.
Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.